Aaron stood at the back of the crowd when the Kreth soldiers came. There were hundreds of people gathered in the open square that morning, humans, Selari, Dravok, and half a dozen other species that the Kreth Empire had swallowed up over the centuries. They all stood together in rows, pressed shoulder to shoulder under the pale grey sky of Vorath Prime. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved more than they had to. When the Kreth soldiers walked through a crowd, you kept your head down and your hands still. Aaron was 22 years old. He had grown up on Vorath Prime, in a small human settlement near the eastern ridge. He was not tall. He was not built like a soldier. He had lean arms, a quiet face, and brown eyes that tended to stay calm even when everything around him was not. The people who knew him said he was the kind of person who never seemed to be in a hurry. Even now, standing in the packed square with soldiers moving through the rows, he simply stood and watched. The Kreth were large creatures. They walked upright like humans but stood nearly 8 feet tall, with thick gray skin and wide flat faces that carried no expression anyone could easily read. They wore dark ceremonial armor today, which meant this was not a regular gathering. Regular gatherings were bad enough. Ceremonial ones were worse. A Kreth elder stepped onto the raised stone platform at the center of the square. He wore long robes the color of dried blood and carried a carved staff that clicked against the stone with each step. Behind him, 2 soldiers dragged a heavy iron cover off a hole in the ground near the edge of the platform. Even from a distance, Aaron could see that the hole was deep. Dark. The crowd shifted uncomfortably at the sight of it. The elder raised his staff and began to speak in the Kreth tongue. A smaller creature standing beside him, a translator, a thin Selari with nervous eyes, repeated the words in the common language. The time of the Vorath ritual has come. One from the human settlement will enter the pit. This is the law of the Kreth. This is how loyalty is proven. Step forward. Nobody moved. That was expected. Nobody ever moved right away. The Kreth knew that. The soldiers knew that. They would wait a few moments, let the silence grow heavy and uncomfortable, and then they would start walking the rows and picking someone themselves. That was how it always went with the other species. The Dravok elder had wept when they took his grandson 2 cycles ago. The Selari woman chosen before that had to be carried to the pit. Aaron looked at the hole in the ground. Then he looked at the people standing around him. His neighbors, the families he had grown up around, the older men and women who had worked themselves thin just trying to keep the settlement alive under Kreth rule. He looked at a woman named May standing 3 rows ahead of him, her hand pressed tightly over her mouth, her young daughter gripping her arm. He took a breath. Then he stepped forward. The crowd parted around him instantly, like water around a stone. He walked through the gap slowly and steadily, hands loose at his sides, eyes forward. He did not rush. He did not drag his feet. He simply walked the way he always walked, like he had somewhere to be and enough time to get there. The Kreth soldiers nearest to him actually stopped moving. One of them tilted its wide head slightly to one side, the way a creature does when it sees something it does not quite understand. Aaron reached the edge of the platform and stopped. He looked up at the elder standing above him. The elder looked down at him. For a moment, neither of them did anything. The translator leaned toward the elder and said something quietly. The elder's flat face did not change, but something shifted in his posture. A slight tightening. The kind of thing you only noticed if you were paying attention. "You step forward willingly," the translator called out. "Yes," Aaron said. The word came out clean and even. No shake in it. No performance of bravery, no clenched jaw or squared shoulders. He simply said yes the way a person says yes when someone asks if they want a second cup of water. The crowd was absolutely silent now. The Kreth soldiers exchanged glances with each other, quick, uncertain looks that the species usually kept carefully hidden. Kreth soldiers were trained from birth to project authority and control. They were not trained for this. They had done this ritual many times with many species, and every single time there had been crying, or struggling, or at least visible fear. That fear mattered to the ritual. It was part of the point. The offered creature was supposed to be afraid. The crowd was supposed to see what happened to the afraid. This was not that. Among the watching crowd, the reaction moved like a slow wave. The Dravok near the left side of the square were whispering to each other in their low clicking language. The Selari were staring. Even some of the younger Kreth soldiers near the back of the square were watching Aaron with something unreadable in their wide faces. The elder raised his staff and gestured toward the pit. 2 soldiers moved to escort Aaron, clearly expecting to grab his arms. Aaron was already walking toward the hole before they reached him. He stopped at the edge, looked down into the dark, and then looked back once at the crowd behind him. Not dramatically. Not like a farewell. He just looked, the way a person looks back at something familiar before a long trip. He found May in the crowd almost immediately. She was staring at him with wet eyes and one hand still pressed over her mouth. Her daughter had buried her face against her mother's side. Aaron held May's gaze for just a moment. Then he gave her the smallest nod. The kind that meant, I know what I am doing. The kind that meant, it is all right. Then he stepped off the edge and dropped into the pit below. The iron cover was dragged back over the hole. The sound of it slamming shut echoed across the stone square and out into the grey morning air of Vorath Prime. Above ground, no one in the crowd spoke. The Kreth elder stood very still on his platform, staff in hand, staring at the sealed pit with an expression that the translator, standing closest to him, had never seen on an elder's face before. It looked, if such a thing were possible, like unease. In all the centuries of Kreth rule, in all the rituals performed across all the conquered worlds, not one offered soul had ever walked to that pit on their own. Not one. Until now. The drop was longer than Aaron expected. He hit the ground hard, bending his knees just in time to keep from snapping something important. The impact still sent a sharp jolt up through his legs and into his back. He stayed low for a moment, hands pressed flat against the stone floor, letting his body catch up with what had just happened. Then he straightened up and looked around. The pit was wider than it had seemed from above. The walls were smooth and tall. Dark gray stone worn flat over what must have been many years of use. There was no ladder. No rope. No way back up that he could see. A thin shaft of pale light came down from the iron cover high above, cutting through the dark in a single weak beam that barely reached the floor. Beyond that narrow light, the pit was full of deep shadow. Aaron stood still and let his eyes adjust. The smell hit him first. It was a thick, sour smell, the kind that sat in the back of the throat and did not leave. He had smelled something like it once before, when a hunting animal near the settlement had crawled under a storage building to die. Rot and heat and something underneath both of those things that was harder to name. His stomach turned once, and then he breathed through his mouth and focused. He heard it before he saw it. A low sound came from the far corner of the pit. Not a roar. Not the kind of savage snarl the crowd above had probably been expecting to hear by now. It was a rough, dragging sound, like something large trying to breathe through pain. Aaron turned toward it slowly and waited until the shadows in that corner began to make sense. The Vorath was enormous. Even hunched low in the corner the way it was, it filled a third of the pit. It had a broad, heavy body covered in dark scaled plates that overlapped like armor along its back and shoulders. Its head was wide and flat at the top, with a long jaw lined with teeth that caught even the faint light from above. Four thick legs held it up, though one of the back legs was held slightly off the ground, trembling with the effort of keeping the animal upright. And along its left side, running from just behind the front leg all the way back toward the hip, there was a wound. Aaron saw it clearly even in the low light. The flesh there was dark and swollen, raised up in a way that healthy tissue never was. The edges of the wound had gone the wrong color, gray and yellow where they should have been clean. Something had torn the Vorath open, and whatever had caused it had happened long enough ago that infection had settled deep into the tissue. The animal had been living with that wound for days. Maybe longer. The Vorath turned its wide head toward Aaron and a sound built low in its throat. A warning. The kind of sound that said, "I see you. I know you are there. Come closer and find out what happens." Aaron did not move. Not yet. He stood in the beam of pale light and simply looked at the animal the way he had always looked at injured things, carefully, without urgency, taking in what was actually there rather than what he was afraid of. He had grown up near the ridge where wild animals sometimes came down from the high ground when the cold season turned hard. He had helped his father treat a wounded ridge cat once when he was 12. He had not forgotten how that felt. The fear was real, but fear was just information. It told you to be careful. It did not tell you to run. He reached up and pulled his shirt over his head. The air in the pit was cold against his bare skin. He folded the shirt once, then gripped it near the collar and tore it in a long clean strip. The sound of the tearing fabric bounced off the stone walls. The Voratha's head snapped up at the noise and the low sound in its throat rose sharply, a genuine snarl this time, full and heavy, the kind that pressed against the chest like a hand. Aaron stopped moving. He waited. The snarl faded back to the low warning sound. The Vorath watched him with eyes that caught the faint light and held it, pale yellow, unblinking, tracking every small shift in his position. Aaron tore another strip. Slower this time. Then another. He worked through the shirt methodically until he had a collection of clean strips hanging from one hand. Then he looked back at the Vorath and began to talk. He did not say anything important. He was not sure the animal understood a single word of it, and that was fine. What mattered was not the words, it was the sound. Low and even. No peaks of panic in it. No sharp edges. Just a voice moving through the air at a steady pace, the way a slow river moves, without urgency and without stopping. He said things like, "I can see that you are hurting. I am not going to make it worse. I am going to come a little closer now. Just a little. You can tell me to stop." He took one step forward. The Vorath shifted its weight. The bad leg buckled slightly and the animal caught itself, and in that small stumble Aaron saw something that no one looking down from above could possibly have seen from that distance. He saw that the Vorath was exhausted. Not just injured. Exhausted in the deep way that came from days of pain with no relief, no sleep, no moment of safety. The animal was not attacking him because it was taking everything it had just to stay standing. He took another step. Then another. The snarling rose and fell as he moved, but it did not turn into a charge. The Vorath held its ground in the corner and tracked him with those pale yellow eyes and made its warnings and did not move. Aaron stopped about 4 feet away. Up close, the wound was worse than it had looked from across the pit. The smell was stronger too. He could see the swelling clearly now, and the way the skin around the edges had pulled tight and wrong. The animal flinched when Aaron slowly raised one hand, palm open, and held it out. They stayed like that for a long time. Then the Vorath lowered its head, just slightly. Just enough. Aaron moved in and began to clean the wound with the strips of cloth, working carefully and slowly, pausing every few seconds to let the animal adjust. The Vorath trembled. Once it made a sound so deep and raw that Aaron felt it in his ribs. But it did not pull away. High above, through the iron cover, someone in the crowd said something in a low voice. Then the square went completely quiet. Nobody up above knew what to do. That was the truth of it, though none of them would have said so out loud. The Kreth elder stood on his platform with his carved staff held in both hands and his wide flat face turned down toward the sealed iron cover. Around him, soldiers stood at their posts. The crowd of conquered species remained in their rows. Everything looked the way it was supposed to look. But the silence was wrong. In every previous ritual, the pit had been loud. There had always been sounds coming up through the iron cover, snarling, crashing, the terrible noise of the Vorath doing what the Vorath did. The crowd would hear it, and the crowd would understand, and the lesson would be delivered without a single word needing to be spoken. That was the point. That had always been the point. Today there was nothing. No crashing. No snarling. No sounds of struggle at all. Just a deep and total quiet coming up from below the iron cover that was somehow worse than any noise could have been. The Kreth soldiers near the pit kept glancing at each other with quick sideways looks they were trained not to show. The translator stood at the edge of the platform and stared at the iron cover as if he could see through it if he tried hard enough. The elder said nothing. He simply waited. But his hands on the staff were tighter than they needed to be. Down in the pit, Aaron was working. He had been at it for a long time. He had lost track of exactly how long. There was no way to measure time down here, no light that changed, no sound from outside that gave him any reference. He only knew that his hands had gone from cold to numb and back to cold again, and that the strips of cloth from his shirt were nearly all used up. The wound was bad. He had done what he could. He had cleaned it as carefully as he was able to with nothing but cloth and the small amount of water from the flask he always kept on his belt. He had pressed the strips firmly against the worst of it and held them there until the bleeding slowed. He had worked around the edges of the infection, clearing away what he could reach, knowing it was not enough but doing it anyway because not enough was still better than nothing. The Vorath had not moved away from him once. That was the thing that struck Aaron most, more than the size of the animal, more than the smell, more than the low sounds it made when he pressed too close to the damaged tissue. The Vorath had stayed. It had flinched and trembled, and once it had snapped its great jaw at the air about 2 feet from Aaron's shoulder, a warning, not an attack, and Aaron had understood the difference and simply paused and waited and then continued. Through all of it, the animal had stayed. At some point, without Aaron quite noticing the moment it happened, the Vorath had lowered itself to the ground. It lay on its good side now, the wounded flank facing up, the great head resting on the stone floor with those pale yellow eyes half closed. Its breathing was still rough and uneven, but the desperate quality had gone out of it. The exhausted trembling in its legs had stilled. Aaron sat beside it with his back against the warm scaled plates of its shoulder, the last strip of cloth pressed against the edge of the wound, and for the first time since he had dropped into the pit he allowed himself to simply breathe. He rested his hand gently on the Vorath's neck. The animal made a low sound. Not a warning. Something different, quieter, slower, the kind of sound that came from somewhere deeper than pain. Aaron closed his eyes for a moment. He was still sitting like that when he heard the scraping sound from above. The iron cover shifted. Then it moved aside with a heavy grinding noise that echoed down the stone walls. Light poured in, much stronger than the thin beam from before, which meant more time had passed than Aaron had realized. The light was the broader gray of mid-morning. Several hours then. At least. He looked up. Faces peered down from the rim, Kreth soldiers, several of them, their wide flat faces unreadable from this distance. One of them called something down in the Kreth tongue. Aaron did not speak Kreth well enough to catch all of it, but he understood the tone. Come up. Now. A rope dropped down and hit the floor beside him. Aaron looked at the rope. Then he looked at the Vorath. The animal's eyes were open again, tracking the faces at the rim above with a slow and steady attention. Its breathing had not changed. It was calm, or as close to calm as an animal that size and in that much pain could reasonably be. Aaron stood up slowly. The moment he moved away from the Vorath's side, the animal's head came up off the floor. Not aggressively. Just, alert. Watching him. Aaron picked up the rope and turned toward the wall. 2 soldiers came down the rope fast, the way trained soldiers move when they have been given a simple order and expect no complications. They dropped to the floor of the pit and crossed toward Aaron immediately, one on each side, reaching for his arms the way you reach for something you fully expect to simply take. The Vorath was on its feet before either soldier got within 3 steps of Aaron. Nobody had seen it move. That was the part that the soldiers would struggle to explain afterward. One moment the animal had been lying on the ground. The next moment it was standing, all 4 legs planted, wounded flank and all, risen to its full height in the time it took to blink. It was taller standing than the soldiers had likely imagined from above. It filled the space between Aaron and the soldiers completely, and it did not make a sound. It simply stood there. The 2 soldiers stopped. They did not back up, they were Kreth soldiers, and Kreth soldiers did not back up. But they stopped. They stood very still and looked up at the Vorath and did not move their hands toward Aaron again. From above, the elder's voice came down sharp and fast. An order. Neither soldier moved. Aaron stood behind the Vorath and looked at the animal's broad back and understood, in a quiet and certain way, what had just happened. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel afraid. He felt something simpler than either of those things, a kind of steadiness, like the ground had just confirmed that it was still there. Above the pit, the crowd of hundreds had gone so quiet that Aaron could hear the wind moving across the open square. The Vorath stood its ground and did not move. And not one soldier in that pit, and not one elder on that platform, and not one soldier in that entire square knew what to do next. They pulled the soldiers out of the pit first. Nobody gave a direct order for it. That was the strange part. The elder on the platform did not announce a retreat. No commander raised a hand and called his men back. It simply became clear, in the way that certain things become clear without anyone saying them out loud, that the soldiers were not going to complete their task. And so the rope was lowered again, and the 2 soldiers climbed out, and the faces at the rim pulled back, and for a long moment the open pit sat there with nothing happening at all. Then a different kind of activity began above. Aaron could hear it even from the bottom of the pit. Hurried footsteps crossing stone. Voices speaking fast and low in the Kreth tongue. The sound of something heavy being moved, a door, or a large container, or something he could not identify. He stayed where he was, one hand resting on the Vorath's flank, and listened to the Empire scrambling above his head. The Vorath had settled again after the soldiers left. It had lowered itself back to the ground slowly, favoring the wounded side, and Aaron had knelt beside it and checked the bindings on the wound. They had held. The bleeding had stopped. The animal was exhausted and the infection was still there, and it needed proper medicine that Aaron did not have. But it was alive, and it was calmer than it had been when he first landed in the pit, and that was what mattered right now. He sat with his back against the Vorath's shoulder and waited. He was good at waiting. He always had been. His father had told him once that patience was not about being passive, it was about understanding that some things could not be rushed, and spending your energy on the things that could. Aaron had thought about that a lot over the years. He thought about it now, sitting in the dark at the bottom of a pit in the middle of a Kreth ritual ground, listening to an Empire try to figure out what to do with him. It took a long time. When the rope finally dropped again, it was followed by the translator, the thin Selari with the nervous eyes who had stood beside the elder on the platform. He came down carefully, hand over hand, and when he reached the floor he turned and looked at Aaron and then at the Vorath and then back at Aaron with an expression that mixed fear and something else in equal parts. "They want you to come up," he said quietly, in the common language. "I know," Aaron said. "Is it safe?" The translator looked at him for a moment as if the question surprised him. Then he said, "The High Elder has called for the ancient texts. There is a discussion happening." Aaron nodded. He stood slowly, making sure the Vorath saw him move before he moved, giving the animal time to adjust. The Vorath raised its head and watched him but stayed down. Aaron put his hand briefly on the side of its neck. "I will come back," he said. He was not sure why he said it. He meant it. He climbed the rope. The light hit him hard after the darkness of the pit. He stood on the stone platform and blinked and let his eyes adjust, and when they did he saw that the square had changed. The crowd was still there, all of them, every species, still in their rows, but the energy in the square was completely different from what it had been that morning. That morning the crowd had been heavy with dread. Now it was something else. Something tighter and more electric that Aaron could feel against his skin, like a change in the air before a storm. The Kreth elders were gathered at the far end of the platform. There were 5 of them now where there had been one before, and in the center of their group a very old Kreth, older than any Aaron had seen, skin gone pale gray and movement slow and deliberate, held an open book. The book was large and flat and its pages were dark with age. The old Kreth's hands moved across the pages carefully, the way hands move over something fragile and important. The High Elder stood slightly apart from the others. Aaron looked at him. The High Elder was the largest Kreth in the square, broad across the shoulders and draped in darker ceremonial robes than the others. He had stood on this platform all morning with perfect stillness and absolute authority. He did not look like that now. He was looking at the open book with an expression that Aaron could read clearly even across the distance between them. His hands were trembling. One of the younger elders said something sharp in the Kreth tongue. The old Kreth with the book responded slowly, one long finger tracing a line of text on the open page. Another elder leaned in to look. Then another. The High Elder stared at the page and did not speak. The translator appeared at Aaron's shoulder. "What does it say?" Aaron asked quietly. The translator swallowed. "It is the law of the Vorath bound," he said, keeping his voice very low. "It is one of the oldest laws in the Kreth record. It has never, in all the history of the Empire, it has never been," he stopped. Steadied himself. "It says that any being accepted and protected by the Vorath is to be declared Vorath bound. And the Vorath bound cannot be imprisoned, cannot be harmed, and cannot be given orders by any rank within the Empire. Including the High Elder." Aaron said nothing. "It also says," the translator continued, his voice dropping even lower, "that the word of the Vorath bound is to be heard and honored in any matter they choose to raise. Without condition." In the crowd below the platform, something was happening that the Kreth soldiers were not able to stop because it was not loud enough to stop. It was quiet, a whisper moving from person to person through the rows of conquered species. Aaron could not hear the words, but he could see the effect of them spreading through the crowd like slow light. Heads coming up. Shoulders straightening. Eyes that had been cast down all morning lifting and fixing on the platform with an expression that the Kreth Empire had spent a very long time trying to make impossible. Hope. The High Elder finally turned and looked at Aaron. The trembling in his hands had not stopped. Aaron looked back at him steadily. He was aware that this moment was large. He was aware that the right words mattered. He was also aware that he was standing on a stone platform in the middle of an alien ritual ground with no shirt on and dried blood from someone else's wound on his hands, and that if he had learned anything from the last several hours it was that complicated situations sometimes responded best to very simple things. He straightened his shoulders. He looked at the High Elder calmly and clearly, the same way he had looked at everything else today, the soldiers, the pit, the Vorath, all of it. Without rushing and without flinching. And then he said it. "I want one thing," Aaron said, his voice carrying clean and flat across the platform. "Free them. All of them. Every people your empire has ever conquered. That is all I am asking for." The square went absolutely still. The whisper in the crowd stopped. And the High Elder, for the first time in the entire history of his rule, had no answer ready. The silence lasted a long time. Aaron stood on the platform and did not fill it. He had said what he came to say and he saw no reason to add anything more to it. The High Elder stood across from him with that same unreadable expression, and the 4 other elders stood behind him with the old book open between them, and nobody spoke. The wind moved across the square. Somewhere in the crowd a child made a small sound and was quickly hushed. Then the High Elder turned to the elders behind him and spoke in a low voice. What followed was not a quick conversation. It went back and forth for a long time, elders leaning toward each other and pulling back, voices rising and dropping, fingers pointing at lines in the open book and then at Aaron and then back at the book. The High Elder spoke less than the others. He mostly listened, and each time an elder pointed to a particular line on the page his jaw tightened slightly and then relaxed again. Aaron watched it all without expression. The translator stood at his shoulder and murmured quietly, giving him pieces of what was being said. The law was clear. That was the problem the elders kept running into, no matter how many times they circled back to it. The words on the page were old but they were not vague. They had been written to cover exactly this situation, a Vorath-bound individual making a formal request, and they used language that left very little room for interpretation. The Empire had written those words themselves, in a time when they believed the law would never actually need to be used. They had never imagined they would one day be standing on their own ritual ground, bound by their own sacred text, listening to a young human with no shirt ask them to dismantle everything they had built. But the law was the law. The High Elder turned back to Aaron. He spoke in the Kreth tongue, slowly and precisely. The translator listened and then said, "He accepts your request. The proclamation of freedom will be issued within 3 days across all Kreth-held territories. The conquered peoples will be released from service and given the right to return to their home worlds or remain where they are as free individuals. The ritual of offering is ended permanently." The translator paused. He also says, another pause, shorter this time, that he hopes you understand what you have done. Aaron looked at the High Elder steadily. "I do," he said. The High Elder held his gaze for one long moment. Then he turned and walked off the platform without another word, the other elders following close behind him, the old book carried carefully under one arm. Their robes swept the stone as they went and then they were gone through the far archway and the platform was empty except for Aaron and the translator and the sound of the wind. For about 3 seconds nothing happened. Then the square came alive. It did not happen like an explosion. It happened the way water breaks through a cracked wall, slowly at first and then all at once. The whisper that had been moving through the crowd became voices, and the voices became something louder, and somewhere in the middle of the crowd a Dravak elder made a sound that Aaron had never heard before, deep and resonant and full, the Dravak expression of something too large for ordinary language. Others picked it up. The Selari in the crowd clasped each other by the arms in the way of their people. Several humans near the back of the square were holding each other and crying without any attempt to hide it. Aaron stood on the platform and watched it and felt something move through him that he did not have a clean word for. It was not pride exactly. It was quieter than pride. It was more like the feeling of setting down something heavy that you had been carrying for so long you had stopped noticing the weight. He looked down at his hands. The dried blood from the Voratha's wound was still there, dark in the creases of his knuckles. He closed his hands slowly and then opened them again. Then he went back down to the pit. He had told the Vorath he would come back. He kept his word. The animal was awake when Aaron came down the rope. It raised its head and tracked him across the floor with those pale yellow eyes and made the low quiet sound, not the warning, the other one, the one Aaron had first heard when he was sitting against its shoulder in the dark. Aaron crossed to it and knelt beside it and checked the wound bindings again. They were still holding. He talked while he worked, low and even, the same way he always talked to the animal. Nothing important. Just sound moving through the air at a steady pace. The Vorath pressed its great head briefly against Aaron's shoulder. Aaron stayed there for a while. In the days that followed, the proclamation moved outward from Vorath Prime the way all Kreth edicts moved, fast and with authority, except this one carried something different inside it than any previous edict had carried. Previous proclamations had expanded the empire or tightened its grip. This one opened it. Across territory after territory, on world after world, the words arrived and were read aloud by Kreth officials who read them in the flat careful voices of people delivering news they had not chosen and could not change. The conquered peoples walked free. Not all at once. Not without difficulty. Freedom after generations of control was not a simple thing, and Aaron knew it would not be. There were logistical problems and resource problems and old wounds between species that had nothing to do with the Kreth and would take years to work through. He did not pretend otherwise. He did not stand on platforms and make speeches about a perfect future. He was not that kind of person, and this was not that kind of story. He stayed on Vorath Prime. He had been offered a place in the formal proceedings. A seat at tables where the details of the transition were being worked out by representatives of a dozen species. He attended some of those meetings when his presence was specifically needed, and he spoke plainly when he spoke, and he listened more than he talked. But when the meetings were done, he went back to the pit. The Kreth had not sealed it again. They had not been able to bring themselves to, Aaron suspected, though no one said so directly. He came each day with clean cloth and clean water and whatever medicines the settlement's doctor could put together that might work on an animal none of them had ever treated before. The wound began to heal. Slowly, then steadily. The infected tissue cleared. The Vorath began to put weight on the bad leg again. Some days Aaron simply sat beside the animal and did nothing in particular. The Vorath seemed to find this acceptable. Word spread the way word always spreads, carried by travelers, repeated in ports, passed from one species to the next across the long dark distances between stars. The story changed in the telling, the way stories do. In some versions Aaron was larger than he was. In some versions the Vorath was more frightening. In some versions the confrontation with the High Elder was more dramatic. Aaron heard some of these versions and found them mildly amusing and did not correct them. But the phrase that attached itself to the story, the one that appeared in record after record across 100 worlds, was plain and simple and needed no embellishment. It had been written first by a Selari historian who had been standing in the crowd that day. She had written it that same evening, while the memory was still fresh, in the careful precise language her people used for things they wanted preserved. It read, "Do not mistake human gentleness for weakness." Nobody argued with it. Nobody who had been in that square on that day, who had watched a young human with calm brown eyes step forward without trembling and drop into a pit and come back out having changed everything, nobody who had seen that argued with it at all.